a whisper hidden in gold, a fracture so precise it could only have been made by intention, not accident. When a symbol of royalty is shattered, what truth spills from within? In this case, silence is as dangerous as the secret it conceals, and every polite smile hides a shadow. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It has long been my observation that the gravest affairs often begin with the faintest ripple. In my time with Sherlock Holmes, I have seen murder cloaked as charity, love turned to vengeance, and the innocuous transformed into the catastrophic. Yet among these accounts, there is one that lingers in my memory for the sheer subtlety of its origins, a case that arose not from a cry in the night nor a body in the street, but from the curious destruction of a jewel. It was during one of those grey, unyielding Februaries when the fog lies thick in the London streets and the coals burn low in their grates. Holmes had taken to his chemical experiments with renewed fervour, the air in our sitting room thick with the acrid tang of reagents and tobacco smoke. I was at my desk, perusing a monograph on Eastern European diplomacy, when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, announced the arrival of a visitor. A most refined lady, sir, and in considerable agitation. Holmes did not look up from his microscope but waved a languid hand. "Show her in, Mrs. Hudson. Let us see what mischief February has wrought today." What followed was a tale at once strange and sombre, one that would carry us beyond Baker Street into the parlours of politics, the vaults of history, and the heart of a secret buried in gold. The woman who entered our quarters bore herself with that peculiar blend of grace and restraint which often marks those accustomed to courtly service. She was tall, with grey-blue eyes that bespoke long years of discipline and perhaps sorrow. She introduced herself as Miss Eliza Fortescue, formerly a lady-in-waiting to Her Majesty the Queen of Varovia, a small Eastern monarchy long troubled by the winds of exile and rebellion. She placed upon the table a velvet-wrapped bundle, which Holmes unrolled with surgical precision. Within lay a delicate tiara, ornate, antique, and unmistakably valuable. But its centre had been snapped in two. The break, though clean, was cruel to the eye. I remember the way the jewels caught the light, as though protesting the indignity of their division. "This," Miss Fortescue began, "is the crown tiara of the House of Varovia, or rather it was. It came to England at the request of Sir Lionel Mero, who hosted a diplomatic gala in its honour. The tiara was displayed in a locked glass case in the main salon at Mero Hall, viewed by dozens of guests." She hesitated here, her voice thinning. "The next morning," she continued, "we found it thus. Broken. No alarm was raised, no signs of forced entry, nothing else taken. Only the tiara, cleanly broken and left in its case." Holmes leaned forward, fingertips steepled. "And the matter was not reported to the authorities?" Miss Fortescue shook her head. "Sir Lionel feared scandal. The Varovians, what remains of their royal court, are volatile. This tiara is more than a symbol. It is history and politics." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And you believe this was no accident?" "I know it was not," she replied, "though I cannot prove it." Holmes turned the fractured tiara over in his gloved hands with the care one reserves for sacred relics. I observed him in silence, knowing better than to interrupt the sharpening of that formidable mind. After a few moments, he set it down and gestured for Miss Fortescue to continue. "The tiara was last seen intact at the gala's end," she explained. "Several guests remained at the estate overnight. Among them were Count Alexei Draganov, a Varovian envoy, Lady Frances Mero, Sir Lionel's sister, and a London jeweller named Mr. Basil Hargreaves, who had appraised the piece prior to its display. The next morning, I was summoned by a maid. We found the tiara exactly as you see it now. Was the case locked? I asked. Yes, no sign of tampering, and the only keys were held by Sir Lionel and myself. And this Mr. Hargrove, did he examine the tiara during the evening? He did, but in full view of the room. There was music, dancing, conversation. No one recalls anything out of place, only that the tiara had drawn great admiration. That, and Count Dragonoff's curiosity. He asked after its craftsmanship several times. Holmes's eyes glinted at that. What puzzles me, Miss Fortescue added, lowering her voice, is not merely the damage, it is the silence. No theft, no threat. Only the sudden surgical fracture of a royal heirloom, as though to send a message no one dares speak. Holmes stood and moved to the window. In my experience, Miss Fortescue, when something is broken with such precision, it is not the object that is the true target, but what it conceals. Holmes asked a final question before Miss Fortescue departed. Tell me, he said, without turning from the frost-laced window pane. Have there ever been whispers, however faint, that this tiara held something within it? Some hidden mechanism, a cavity perhaps? She blinked in astonishment. How did you... There have been such rumours, she admitted after a moment. Old Varovian legends speak of royal jewels that bore secret messages during the civil strife. My late mistress once hinted, only once, that the tiara was entrusted with a legacy far greater than its jewels. A dangerous inheritance, Holmes said softly. The Varovian delegation returns to the continent within days, she said. If word of this break reaches the press, or worse, the wrong faction, it could mean disgrace, or war. With that ominous warning, Miss Fortescue departed into the bleak London air, leaving the shattered crown upon our table like the aftermath of some quiet explosion. Holmes, still at the window, drew deeply upon his pipe. I watched the tendrils of smoke curl upwards, mirroring the tangled thoughts that no doubt moved within his mind. Watson, he said at last, what do you make of it? That someone went to extraordinary lengths to destroy a symbol of peace. Holmes turned, his eyes keen. No, my dear fellow, someone went to extraordinary lengths not to destroy a symbol, but to retrieve a truth, one that was never meant to see daylight. The hours that followed Miss Fortescue's departure were marked by an intensity of thought I had come to recognize in Holmes as the precursor to decisive action. He sat motionless for some time, eyes half-lidded, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The broken tiara remained untouched on the table before us, its fractured center gleaming coldly in the firelight. At last, he rose and moved to his desk, where he consulted a small leather-bound notebook, one I knew to contain a curious mixture of political gossip, criminal patterns, and obscure historical facts. He jotted something swiftly upon a scrap of paper, folded it, and handed it to me. You will be so good, Watson, he said, as to deliver this telegram to the Varovian consulate. It is addressed to Count Petrov, an old adversary of mine in certain Balkan intrigues. I wish to gauge the political temperature before we set foot on Mero soil. You mean to take the case, then? I asked. He regarded me with that familiar, unreadable expression. My dear fellow, when a relic of dynastic consequence is found sundered in a locked room, with no thief, no motive, and no confession, it is not merely a puzzle. It is an invitation. And what of the danger? A smile touched his lips. It is precisely because the danger is veiled in silk that it warrants our presence. He turned back to the tiara and spoke once more, his voice low. This is no ordinary theft, Watson. It is an act performed with knowledge, precision, and purpose. And I intend to know why. And thus began one of the most perplexing and politically sensitive cases of our shared career. We departed for Mero Hall 2 days hence, the frost still clinging stubbornly to the hedgerows as our train rattled into the Hampshire countryside. Holmes was unusually reticent during the journey, his mind no doubt preoccupied with the fractured artifact and the veiled politics it carried upon its gilded arches. I had brought along a copy of the Times, but I found myself reading the same paragraph over and over, my thoughts returning invariably to the image of Miss Fortescue's haunted face. Mero Hall stood atop a ridge of ash trees, its grey stone facade as stark as the reputation of its master. Sir Lionel Mero greeted us with a stiff courtesy, an ageing man with a military bearing, silver hair brushed immaculately back, and a gaze like tempered steel. If he felt any relief at our arrival, he concealed it with the discipline of a man long accustomed to secrecy. "I am not one for drama, Mr. Holmes," he said, ushering us into the drawing-room, "but I will not deny that I am most uneasy." "Then let us deal in facts rather than theatrics," Holmes replied, removing his gloves. "I shall need to see the tiara and the display case, and I trust your household has remained undisturbed since the incident." "Entirely," Sir Lionel affirmed. "Those guests who were here for the gala have remained under polite pretense, though I suspect more than one knows we await an investigation." As we ascended the staircase to the salon, I could not shake the sensation that Mero Hall itself watched us, that behind every tapestry and portrait, something waited. It was a house built for secrets, and we had just stepped inside its shadowed heart. The salon was an elegant chamber of oak-panelled walls and gilt-edged mirrors, though my eye was drawn at once to the centrepiece, a glass case of considerable craftsmanship, within which the broken tiara lay upon a bed of deep crimson velvet. Holmes approached the display with reverence, bending close to the fractured diadem. His hands, gloved in grey suede, moved with the same precision I had seen him employ at crime scenes. He examined the central break, the jewel settings, and the filigree framework with unwavering focus. "Curious," he murmured. I stepped beside him. "What do you observe?" He tapped gently on the edge of the casing. "The break is not the result of force applied in anger or haste. It is surgical. The tiara was severed with knowledge, perhaps by someone familiar with its structure." Sir Lionel nodded grimly. "It was untouched when I retired. Locked, of course. And in the morning, we found it as you see now." Holmes pointed to a barely perceptible smear upon the inside of the glass. "And this? A residue of some sort." "I assumed it to be polish," Sir Lionel replied. "But if it is significant—" "It is solder," Holmes corrected softly. "Lead-based, by the smell. Not fresh, but recently disturbed." He then lifted the tiara gently and peered beneath it. And here, a slight impression in the velvet, as though something were once housed beneath the central arc. Something slender, narrow. I watched as he examined the clasp. "Do you see that, Watson? A tampered hinge. Someone opened it, not to steal the tiara, but something within it." "But nothing else was taken," I said, still struggling to grasp the full implication. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Precisely. Which begs the question, what was the true object of value?" Having concluded our preliminary inspection, we were ushered into the east parlour to take tea with those guests who remained at Mero Hall. I noted at once a curious tension among them, a stillness behind their smiles, like a portrait hung askew. Lady Frances Mero, sister to our host, was the first to speak. She was a woman of statuesque bearing and a piercing gaze, her hair drawn into a chignon so severe it seemed a form of armour. "I do hope you find this business quickly resolved, Mr. Holmes," she said, her tone cool. "It has cast quite the shadow over what was intended as a diplomatic celebration." "I find that shadows often cast the truest outlines," Holmes replied. Seated by the fireplace was Count Alexei Dragonov, a pale, sharp-featured man whose Varovian accent danced just behind his vowels. He inclined his head. "It is most unfortunate," he said, "but the tiara was, after all, merely a relic. Symbolic, yes, but not irreplaceable." Holmes gave no reply, only a faint hum as he turned to the final guest. A man with sunken cheeks, restless fingers, and a jeweller's loop still hanging from his coat. "Mr. Basil Hargrove, I presume," Holmes said. Hargrove gave a twitch of a bow. "I had the honour of appraising the tiara before the gala. A marvel of Varovian filigree. Delicate work. Irreplaceable, as His Excellency says." "I imagine you inspected it quite closely," Holmes mused. "Oh, yes," Hargrove said. "But always in the presence of Sir Lionel or his sister." Holmes regarded them all with an unreadable expression. "I find it fascinating," he said at last, "how often the surface of things proves the most deceptive. And though the tea was hot and the fire burned brightly, I could not help but feel that every word spoken in that parlour carried the chill of something unspoken, something dangerous lying just beneath the glass. As the day wore on, Holmes requested a second, private inspection of the tiara and its display case, this time without the presence of Sir Lionel or his guests. We returned to the salon under the pretext of Holmes requiring time to sketch the damage for his notes, though I suspected this was merely a polite fiction to rid the room of eyes. He bent over the velvet-lined base of the glass case once more, this time retrieving from his coat pocket a small magnifier and a curved silver probe. I remained silent, standing at the window, for I had learned that the thread of Holmes's deductions must not be disturbed in its weaving. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly at last, "this depression here, barely perceptible, yet unmistakably present." I crossed to his side and looked where he indicated. Indeed, beneath the central arch of the tiara's placement was a shallow impression, as though some object, perhaps no larger than a finger, had once rested there. "Now consider this," he continued, tapping gently at the hinge beneath the broken segment. "The clasp bears the residue of friction, but it is not consistent with ordinary handling. This has been opened recently, and not by one unfamiliar with its construction. And yet," I said, "no part of the tiara is missing, only broken. Which suggests," he said, "that what was taken was never part of the ornament at all." He next turned his attention to the edge of the case, where a faint streak of dull metallic residue clung to the inner frame. "Solder," he confirmed. "Not newly applied, but recently disturbed. It would appear someone accessed the tiara's hidden mechanism with care and then resealed it, hoping the break itself would be blamed on mishandling." "And why break it at all?" I asked. Holmes gave a faint smile. "To draw attention from the true absence." He straightened slowly. "This was not vandalism. It was extraction, disguised as damage." We took supper with the household that evening, an occasion marked by silences more eloquent than speech. Holmes remained unreadable throughout, content to observe rather than to speak. I, on the other hand, felt increasingly the presence of tension, not merely beneath the words exchanged, but embedded in the very air between us. After the meal, I excused myself under the pretext of a walk, though in truth I wished to wander the corridors of Mero Hall, as if the house itself might betray its secrets when left unattended. The old portraits lining the halls stared down with aloof indifference, and I passed the closed doors of the east wing with a curious awareness that each concealed not merely rooms, but motives. Near the conservatory, I encountered Lady Frances alone, peering out into the garden under the pretence of seeking the moon. She greeted me with a cool nod, then said, without turning, "Does your friend often find guilt where others see only misfortune?" "More often than you might think," I replied. Her voice lowered a degree. "Then I do hope his methods are as infallible as his confidence suggests." Before I could answer, she vanished through the archway with a rustle of silk, returning to the drawing room, I found Holmes reading a Varovian travelogue, no doubt a subtle gesture meant to disquiet Count Dragonov, who sat nearby pretending not to notice. Mr. Hargreaves had excused himself early, citing a headache, though Holmes gave me a look which suggested he found the timing medicinally convenient. As the clock chimed 9, I leaned toward Holmes. "You are convinced, then, that one of them is responsible?" He did not look up. "What I am convinced of, Watson, is that 3 people know more than they say, and one of them is afraid." "Afraid?" "Profoundly so," he said. "And that fear is the one honest emotion we have yet seen in this house." We retired to our rooms late that night, but I found no rest. My mind churned with doubt and theories, and in the stillness of the hallway beyond my door, I fancied I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and quickly retreating. The following morning brought with it a disquieting development, one that sent a ripple of consternation through the already tense household. Shortly after breakfast, Sir Lionel summoned Holmes and myself to his study, where his expression betrayed a frustration ill-suited to his otherwise stoic military disposition. "One of my footmen has absconded," he announced tersely. "Young fellow by the name of Evans. He was last seen last evening just after the dinner hour. This morning his room is vacant, no note, no word. His uniform remains, but he is gone." Holmes gave no outward sign of surprise. "And when was he hired?" "Only a fortnight ago. A replacement for our usual man who took ill." "And you say he left his livery?" "Yes, along with a half-packed case and an unpaid wages chit still on the desk." Holmes nodded. "Then he did not flee in haste, nor in guilt." "You believe he was coerced?" I asked. "I believe he was silenced," Holmes replied calmly. "Whether by gold or by fear remains to be seen." Lady Frances, when informed, responded with a dismissive wave. He was of no importance, a forgetful boy, prone to wandering. I suspected he would not last. Yet I noticed Holmes glance at her more intently than her remark perhaps warranted. When I later inquired as to his thoughts, he replied only, "A missing servant is a dull occurrence, Watson, but a conveniently missing servant. Now that is intriguing." The household whispered of flight, theft, even treason. Some suggested the young man had been bribed by foreign hands. Others believed he had overheard too much and had vanished for his own safety. But in the hush that followed, I could not escape the notion that whatever knowledge the footman possessed had rendered him either invaluable or expendable. And somewhere in the house, I believed, someone was relieved to find his room empty. Later that afternoon, Holmes requested a moment alone with Lady Frances. The conversation took place in the sunroom, a chamber of pale light and creeping ivy, while I remained just outside the door under the thinnest pretext of examining the bindings of a botanical journal. I have long since abandoned the notion that Holmes's interviews are best conducted in private, for even his silence can be telling when watched by a friend who knows him well. "I understand," Holmes began, "that you retired early on the night of the banquet." "I did," she replied, with cool precision. "The noise was insufferable, and I had no interest in politics disguised as pleasantries." "You retired alone?" "I always do." There was a pause. Then Holmes said, "Yet you were seen descending the servants' staircase well past midnight." I heard a rustle, the shift of a gown or perhaps the tightening of resolve. "I had misplaced my bracelet," she said after a moment. "It had sentimental value." "And did you find it?" "No," she said, "but I found peace of mind." "Curious," Holmes mused, "that a woman who values peace should move so quietly and in a direction opposite her own chambers." Another pause. I could sense the tension mounting like static. "Mr. Holmes," she said icily, "am I to be interrogated for wandering my own house?" "Certainly not," he replied, "but it is customary for the innocent to wander less strategically." He exited the room moments later, his face unreadable. We walked together down the corridor before I ventured. "You believe she's lying?" "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that her truth is smaller than the facts allow. She was not searching for a bracelet, Watson. She was ensuring that something remained unseen." "But what?" "That," he said, "depends entirely on what was seen." The estate grounds at Mero Hall were expansive, and that afternoon Holmes requested a walk through the gardens, ostensibly for air. I was not fooled. He rarely sought air unless it carried the scent of answers. Our stroll took us to the cedar grove at the southern end of the property, a secluded copse near the perimeter wall. Holmes moved with purpose, scanning the paths, pausing now and then to study footprints, crushed grass, and the frayed edge of a recently disturbed hedge. "This," he said at last, pointing to a clearing between two gnarled trunks, "was a place of conversation, not solitude." "How can you be sure?" He knelt and produced from the earth a small metal object. It was no larger than a coin, tarnished but not old. "A Varovian cufflink," he said. "And this," he gestured to a stub of a cigar ground into the soil, "is an expensive blend favoured by English jewellers of a particular taste. Mr. Hargreaves, to be precise." "You believe they met here?" I asked. "I believe they conspired here," Holmes replied. "A foreign envoy and a specialist in metals, both with access to the Tiara and reason to be near it, both under the same roof, both denying any association. And what does it mean? That depends on who approached whom." We returned to the house by a less used path, and Holmes requested a quiet word with Sir Lionel. I do not know what passed between them, but Sir Lionel emerged from the study with a pallor more suited to a deathbed than diplomacy. "You have done well to keep this quiet," Holmes said to me that evening, "but the silence may soon be shattered." "Do you suspect Dragonoff?" "I suspect ambition," he replied, "and ambition wears many faces, some that smile and others that wait in the cedars." That evening, while the house retired to its customary hush, Holmes and I remained in the library. A small fire burned low, and Holmes, seated at the writing desk, had spread before him several documents borrowed from Sir Lionel's archives with reluctant permission. Among them was a sheaf of yellowing correspondence between Varovian dignitaries and British officials, mostly diplomatic pleasantries and ceremonial minutiae. Yet Holmes, with his characteristic instinct for significance buried in the mundane, lingered over a letter bearing a ciphered marginal note. "Here," he said, tapping a line with his finger. "This phrase, 'the burden hidden in the diadem,' must not reach the port. It is couched in the language of poetry, yet unmistakably utilitarian." "A metaphor?" I ventured. "Hardly. It is a warning." He stood abruptly and moved to the fireplace, where he paced in silence. "Watson," he said finally, "do you recall Miss Fortescue's hesitation when I asked about legends surrounding the tiara?" "Yes. She said her mistress once hinted at it carrying more than jewels." Holmes nodded. "There is a long-standing Varovian custom, one not publicly acknowledged, in which royal jewels were fashioned not merely as adornments, but as vessels. Messages, decrees, even declarations of war were at times hidden within them, to be delivered in exile or passed hand to hand across borders." "You believe the tiara held such a message?" "I believe," he replied, "that it held a letter written during the last exile of Queen Anastasia, one that, if exposed, could rekindle civil unrest, and worse, implicate the British court in shielding certain elements of the Varovian rebellion." "Good Lord," I said, "that would explain the precision of the break. Someone knew exactly what they were after." "Precisely. The object was not the tiara, it was the silence it protected." He returned to the desk and studied a second page. "Note 2, the consistent reference to the inner arc of the crown. That language is peculiar to the ciphered notes of the Varovian resistance. And if the message is now missing, then someone holds in their hand a fuse, and we, Watson, are racing the spark. The following morning brought with it a sealed envelope, hand-delivered and bearing the diplomatic seal of Varovia. Sir Lionel summoned Holmes and me to his study to witness its contents. The missive was brief, but its tone could not have been clearer. Sir Lionel, we are disturbed by reports, unofficial but credible, that a relic entrusted to your care has been defiled. You are surely aware of the weight such a symbol carries in our nation's eyes. Should it be proven that negligence or deception played any part in this, the consequences will not be diplomatic. In service of his grace, Count Petrov Sir Lionel passed the letter across his desk, his lips compressed into a thin line. This, he said, is not merely posturing. Petrov does not waste ink on idle threats. Nor does he show his full hand, Holmes murmured. Note the word defiled, not damaged, not destroyed. It suggests knowledge, specific knowledge, of the tiara's internal construction. Sir Lionel gave a grim nod. Then someone has spoken. Holmes was silent for a moment, then said, We must consider, Sir Lionel, that the message once hidden within the tiara is no longer in this house, and that the Varovians believe it to be in your possession. You think they suspect me of taking it. I think they suspect England, and you, as its steward in this affair, are the lightning rod for their suspicion. Sir Lionel's face hardened. Then I trust you, Mr. Holmes, will bring this matter to light before it darkens us all. Holmes gave a slight bow. That is my intention, though I fear, before the dawn, we may have to descend yet deeper into the night. As the day wore on, I found myself more uneasy than I cared to admit. It was not merely the looming spectre of political disaster, nor even the increasingly fragile civility within the household. It was Holmes himself, his manner grown more distant, more withdrawn, as though the puzzle had reached a depth where even his formidable mind might falter. We walked together briefly through the West Gardens, and though I attempted to elicit some reaction, he answered in half-sentences, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the hedges and hills. Holmes, I said at last, you have faced murderers, spies, and lunatics. Do you truly believe this? This hidden letter poses a greater challenge. He turned to me, and for a moment, the mask slipped. It is not the message, Watson, he said softly. It is the deliberate silence around it. Every step I take forward, the ground beneath shifts. Each suspect is both actor and observer, each motive tangled in another's. And now, we must catch not merely a thief, but a ghost. It was the first time in our long acquaintance that I heard uncertainty in his voice, not of logic, but of timing. The fear that the trap, once sprung, might catch too late. And so I, too, began to doubt, not Holmes's genius, but whether genius alone would be enough. It was on the morning of the fourth day that Holmes declared, with a tone of casual confidence wholly at odds with the tension that had come to inhabit Mero Hall, that he had resolved the matter of the tiara's damage and proposed a second public viewing that very evening in the main salon. The announcement, delivered over a breakfast of weak tea and sullen glances, was met with polite surprise. Sir Lionel nodded stiffly, Lady Frances arched a single eyebrow, Count Draganov said nothing at all, and Mr. Hargreaves fumbled his cup with more haste than dexterity. I shall see to its preparation personally, Holmes added. It will, of course, require delicate handling. Once we were alone, I turned to him. You mean to confront the thief during the viewing? Not directly, he said, opening his satchel to reveal the tiara, now joined, imperfectly, at its broken centre by a thin, gleaming hinge. Observe, Watson. I have inserted into the frame a sliver of paper, rolled tight, and placed within a false cavity I fashioned with Mr. Hargreaves' own soldering technique. A decoy. Precisely. A counterfeit message bearing the royal seal in facsimile. It will be invisible to the naked eye but detectable to anyone who knows what they are looking for. And you believe they will attempt to retrieve it again? Human greed, Holmes said, is rarely content with success if there is still risk to be eliminated. The party responsible will not rest until they are certain the trail is cold. And if they take the bait, then we shall know our thief. For tonight, Watson, we do not merely exhibit a crown, we bait a confession. So it was that the trap was laid. Not with force, but with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that to catch the cunning, one must become more cunning still. That evening, as twilight descended over the estate and the servants lit the lamps, the guests assembled once more in the drawing-room. The air held that peculiar stillness one associates with performances, each face polite, each word measured, and beneath it all a waiting tension that I could not ignore. The tiara rested beneath its glass once more, and Holmes stood beside it with a small pointer in hand, offering a most uncharacteristic lecture on Verrovian ornamentation. I observed the expressions in the room with greater interest than his remarks. Lady Frances was unreadable. Count Draganov remained fixed upon the display, his fingers clasped behind his back. Hargreaves stood off to one side, silent but visibly uneasy, his gaze flickering often to Holmes's hands. Holmes concluded his remarks with a flourish. "And so," he said, "the tiara is restored. Though beauty may be fractured, meaning endures." A curious toast was raised, and the room dispersed shortly after. But Holmes had achieved his purpose. The bait had been shown, and from the glances exchanged behind lifted glasses, it was clear that one of them believed the lie. Later, as we stood at the threshold of the hallway, Holmes said in a low voice, "The stage is set. Let us now see who dares walk it alone." It was just past the second hour of the morning when Holmes roused me from a light doze with a gentle touch to the shoulder. Clad in dressing gowns, we descended in silence to the salon, where the display case remained untouched from earlier that evening, at least to the untrained eye. Holmes extinguished the lamp and gestured for silence. We positioned ourselves behind a folding screen in the far corner, with a narrow view of the tiara's pedestal and the door that led from the hallway. We waited, and waited still. Then, just as I was beginning to suspect the bait had failed, the door creaked inward and a shadow passed across the room. A figure stepped in with surprising confidence, moving not like a panicked thief, but like a man executing a task rehearsed a dozen times in his mind. The intruder approached the case, withdrew a small tool from within his coat, and with practiced ease opened the glass top. Holmes gripped my arm. I recognized the man at once. Basil Hargrove. He removed the tiara, turned it in the light, and with delicate precision pressed the hidden clasp. The false microfilm slid into his waiting hand. In that instant, Holmes stepped into the room and struck a match. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "I believe you have just stolen something that never existed." The jeweller froze, the blood draining from his face. I can explain." "I do hope so," Holmes said, "for you have just sealed not only your own guilt, but that of your employer." "What employer?" Hargrove stammered. Behind us, another door opened with sudden violence, and Lady Frances stood in her dressing gown, pale and breathless. Holmes turned to her. "No need for theatre, madam. Your scene concluded hours ago." For a long moment, no one spoke. Hargrove stood as if rooted to the floor, the counterfeit microfilm trembling between his fingers. Lady Frances, her face pale and drawn, fixed Holmes with a stare that was not one of fear, but of cold calculation. Holmes advanced slowly, his voice calm and deliberate. "You had access to the tiara, Mr. Hargrove. You examined it prior to the gala. You knew its craftsmanship intimately, well enough to detect the hinge, the cavity, and the purpose behind them. But knowledge is not motive. He turned then to Lady Frances. The motive came from elsewhere. Hargreaves' hand dropped, and with it the pretence he had so poorly maintained. She said it was harmless, he said in a low voice, that it would never be missed, that it was all politics and dust. Holmes offered no judgment in his tone, and yet you broke into the display not once, but twice. First to retrieve the message, tonight, to ensure that nothing remained behind. She was desperate, Hargreaves said. She spoke of debts, of threats from abroad, of honour lost long ago. Holmes regarded him coolly. "And what of your honour, Mr. Hargrove?" Hargrove met his gaze, but it was not defiance I saw there. It was exhaustion. "I believed her," he said. "And now I have nothing left but that belief." Holmes nodded to Sir Lionel, who had entered moments earlier and now stood in grim silence. "Place him under house restraint," Holmes said. "The constabulary will find their evidence plain enough come morning." As Hargrove was escorted from the room, I turned to Holmes. "And Lady Frances?" He did not answer at once. His gaze lingered on the door through which she had vanished. "We do not yet know," he said quietly, "what else she believes herself capable of." It was nearly dawn when Lady Frances Mero reappeared. She came not as a cornered culprit, but as a hostess, composed, elegant, and without a trace of dishevelment. She entered the study where Holmes, Sir Lionel, and I sat in silence, and without waiting to be invited, took her place before the hearth. "I assume," she said, "that Mr. Hargrove has implicated me." "You assume correctly," Holmes replied, "though I dare say you left little to assumption." She gave a faint, brittle smile. "Basil is a fool, but a loyal one." Holmes leaned forward. "And what of you, Lady Frances? Were you loyal to your brother, to your country, or merely to your own secrets?" Her eyes flashed. "What would you know of it, Mr. Holmes? Of what it means to stand in the shadow of a legacy one never chose? I have watched men make fortunes from war, gamble honour at court, and bury truths beneath velvet and stone." Holmes said nothing. He let her speak. "Yes, I knew of the letter," she continued. "Years ago, when my brother hosted the last Varovian envoy, I helped catalogue the royal collection. I saw the mechanism. I didn't know then what it contained, but I remembered. And when I learned the tiara would be displayed again, when I heard rumours of that letter's existence, I decided to act." "You believed the message could be sold," Holmes said. "I knew it could," she replied, "to certain parties in Vienna or St. Petersburg. Do you understand what they would pay for proof that the British Crown shielded Varovian traitors?" Sir Lionel, whose silence until now had been ironclad, spoke. "You endangered lives, Frances, not only your own." She turned to him, and for the first time her voice trembled. "And what of the lives lost already? Of our name dragged through bankruptcies, scandals, and exile? This house is a mausoleum, Lionel. I merely sought to purchase a little life for it again." Holmes stood. "You sought to revive honour by bartering treason. That is a paradox history rarely forgives." Lady Frances did not resist when Sir Lionel summoned the authorities, nor did she weep. She departed Mero Hall with the dignity of one who had long prepared for disgrace. As the sun rose beyond the ridge, Holmes and I stood at the window, the broken tiara once more enclosed in its glass. "You were right, Holmes," I said quietly. "It was never about the tiara." "No," he said, "only what it was forced to carry." We remained at Mero Hall for 2 days following Lady Frances's arrest, as the official inquiries commenced and the tiara, fractured but no longer mysterious, was returned to its velvet cradle. It was during that quiet interlude, when the house no longer bristled with secrets but bore the emptiness of resolution, that Holmes, at my request, offered a full account of the case. He stood before the display once more, hands clasped behind his back, eyes flicking across the ornate pattern, as though it were a page from a familiar text. "You recall, Watson," he began, "my first observation. The cleanness of the break, the precision of the hinge. It was not the violence of a thief, but the touch of one who knew where to press and when to apply force." I nodded. "And the residue you found within the case, the solder?" "Exactly. An amateur or even a clever criminal would have risked damaging the frame. But this was the work of a jeweller with exacting knowledge. Mr. Hargreaves did not find the cavity by chance. He had prepared it. The hinge was not tampered with. It was rediscovered." He turned to me then, more animated than he had been in days. "You see, this tiara was not merely an ornament. It was a container. A vessel forged during one of Verrovia's darker chapters. A time when court messages could not pass by parchment alone. What better place to hide a message than within a jewel meant to rest upon a queen's brow?" "And the message itself?" I asked. "A letter," Holmes replied, "written by Queen Anastasia herself during the waning days of her court. A letter addressed to a foreign ambassador, imploring support, promising favour, perhaps revealing alliances too dangerous to name aloud. The very existence of that message would be enough to shatter what remains of the Verrovian nobility. Then it was real. Yes. And now, gone. Destroyed, sold, perhaps buried anew. But its effect remains." I said nothing for a time. Holmes resumed, softer now. "The brilliance was not in hiding the message, Watson. It was in hiding it where none would dare look, beneath a symbol so revered that to question it would seem a crime in itself." We returned to Baker Street on the third evening, the fog curling once more about our windows as though to welcome us back into its shroud. It was there, in the comfort of our sitting room, that I finally pressed Holmes to explain the sequence by which he had pieced the mystery together. "It was not one clue," he said, "but rather a symphony of small ones. First, the scent. Subtle, almost hidden beneath the polish of the case. Lead solder, Watson. Not fresh, but disturbed. That was my first indication the tiara had been opened and closed, but without visible damage. That told me it was not a smash-and-grab affair. I recalled the moment clearly, the faint tang in the salon, barely perceptible. And the depression in the velvet. Precisely. An impression not made by the tiara's structure, but by something once held within it. A cylinder, likely rolled and sealed. It explained the strange symmetry of the break, why the object appeared to fracture where it did. The fracture was a byproduct, not the goal. He lit his pipe then, and I saw in his gaze the glow of satisfaction, the kind he rarely permitted himself to express in public. "But the final piece," he continued, "was Lady Frances's remark, so subtle it may have escaped notice. On the second night she said to you, 'Beauty endures, even when truth does not.' A curious sentiment, don't you think? Especially from someone who insisted she had no knowledge of the tiara's past." I was silent. I had dismissed the line as idle musing at the time. "It was not what she said," Holmes murmured, "but the manner in which she said it. That weary tone, not of speculation, but of remembrance. She had read the letter. That much was clear. And from that moment, I knew she was not merely hiding something. She was grieving the burden of having seen it. And the deception? The repaired hinge?" Holmes smiled. A mirror for her own actions. She had repaired the world's view of the tiara, but not the truth beneath it. That, Watson, is where most deceptions begin. Not in malice, but in the mistaken belief that the world is not yet ready for the truth. In the days that followed our return to London, I found myself haunted not by the image of the broken tiara, nor even the downfall of Lady Frances, but by the sheer elegance with which deceit had been draped in refinement. I have walked beside Holmes through the lowest alleys of Limehouse and the bloodied moors of Dartmoor, yet there was something singular in the cold civility of Mero Hall. Here the deception had worn gloves, spoken French, and toasted diplomacy with port and crystal. And still, the effect had been just as devastating. "I cannot help but feel," I said to Holmes one evening, "that the greatest danger we face as a civilization is not brute force or open betrayal, but secrets passed quietly, between manicured hands." Holmes did not answer immediately. He was gazing out the window, the tip of his pipe glowing faintly in the dusk. "The higher the pedigree," he said at last, "the more carefully truth is trimmed to fit." He tapped the bowl gently and added, "But truth, like smoke, has a tendency to rise." That night, as I recorded the details of the affair, I found myself less eager to celebrate the solving of the puzzle and more inclined to ponder its implications. For though Holmes had, as ever, unravelled the mystery with impeccable logic, I could not escape the sensation that we had glimpsed, however briefly, a truth far older than any relic of Varovia. That there are forces, personal, political, and deeply human, that cannot be locked in glass or polished for display. They live instead in memory, in motive, in fracture. And that, perhaps, is what truly endures. What became of the message, the sliver of history, extracted so carefully from the Varovian crown, was never fully disclosed in public records, nor, I suspect, even in those quiet, diplomatic channels through which such secrets are allowed to vanish. I can attest, however, to what I witnessed in the week that followed. At Holmes's suggestion, and with Sir Lionel's reluctant approval, the counterfeit microfilm was returned to the Varovian delegation under a veil of extreme discretion. A trusted intermediary, a librarian from the British Museum with ties to both courts, delivered the false message in a sealed envelope bearing the official wax of the Foreign Office. It was received without public acknowledgement, and no further word came from Count Petrov or his associates. "The point," Holmes remarked to me, "is not that they believe it genuine, but that they must pretend to. That, my dear Watson, is what brings peace more often than truth." As for Lady Frances Mero, she was escorted aboard a private steamer bound for Trieste within days of her confession. No trial was held, no charges were formally levied. It was understood, tacitly, painfully, that her disgrace would be exile enough. Her name was not mentioned again in society, save in whispers, and Sir Lionel bore the weight of her actions in silence. Mr. Basil Hargrove, by contrast, was arrested and charged with criminal conspiracy and tampering with diplomatic property. His sentence, I am told, was lenient, due largely to Holmes's testimony that the man had acted under manipulation rather than malice. He was released after a brief term and is said to have left London for good. The Tiara was returned to its case, though not to its former purpose. It now rests in the lower vaults of the Royal Varovian Trust, no longer displayed, its broken joint repaired, but not concealed. "I doubt," Holmes said as we viewed it one final time, "that it shall ever be worn again. Its beauty remains, yes, but the purpose for which it was once created has outlived its usefulness, or perhaps it has merely changed form." "Do you think," I asked, "that its history will ever be told in full?" He gave a faint smile. "History has always been a matter of selection, Watson. And selection, as we have seen, is the art of leaving just enough truth behind to satisfy those who no longer ask the right questions." We returned to Baker Street under a low grey sky that seemed to mirror the tone of our reflections. The case had not ended with triumph, nor had it left behind the simplicity of good vanquishing evil. Instead, it had settled into that peculiar realm Holmes often referred to as the shadowed edge, a place where motives intermingled with necessity, and right was tempered by realism. It was 2 days after our return when Holmes, seated before the fire, addressed me without lifting his eyes from the flames. "There is a kind of fracture, Watson," he said, "that no craftsman can mend. Not because the break is irreparable, but because the flaw existed from the moment of creation." I said nothing, knowing he was not speaking solely of the tiara. He continued, "It is a curious thing, is it not? That a simple hinge, unnoticed for years, should determine the course of nations, or that a woman, poised and intelligent, should wager her future upon what she believed was merely hidden, when, in truth, it had already been discovered by others." "Do you regret taking the case?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Number, I regret only that the world demands such cases be hidden from view, that we must sew together the fabric of appearances, even as we uncover the seams." I recorded his words that evening, not because they were dramatic, but because they held the quiet clarity of something earned. And as I closed my notebook, I found myself thinking not of jewels, nor of letters, but of fracture lines, those subtle, nearly invisible weaknesses that lie beneath the grandest constructions, whether in gold, or in families, or in truth. It is not always the force that breaks them. It is the flaw that was always waiting. We sat by the fire at Baker Street, the case behind us, but not yet settled in my mind. Holmes stared into the embers with that peculiar stillness of his thoughts not at rest, but folded inwards, like a letter sealed and unread. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how something so delicate, a hinge, a whisper, a hesitation, can determine the rise or fall of an entire affair. We chase grand conspiracies, yet it is the hairline fracture that betrays the whole structure." I looked over at the tiara, now returned to its box, its gleam dulled by everything it had carried. "And yet," I said, "some fractures begin at the moment of creation." Holmes nodded. "Precisely, and those are the ones no craftsman nor conscience can repair. But tell me, what do you think was the true turning point in this case? Was it the broken tiara, or the moment someone decided to hide the truth beneath it? Share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading how you unravel the mystery in your own way. And if you enjoyed this case, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures, and share the story with someone who loves a truly clever mystery. The game is never quite over. Until next time.